we know that when team members feel valued, tardiness goes down, absenteeism goes down, following through on policies and procedures increases, customer service ratings go up, there's less conflict among colleagues. And so for a supervisor or manager, they now have more time to do the work that they're supposed to do rather than manage the crap that comes from people not feeling valued. Managers enjoy their work more when their team members feel valued.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. If you've heard of the 5 love languages, you know that different people express and receive love differently. For years, we've implemented this knowledge within our personal relationships, but Paul White has found a way to apply them to work through his book, The 5 Languages of Appreciation in the Workplace. With 25 years of experience as a psychologist, researcher, author, and leadership trainer, Paul has worked with companies like Microsoft and NASA to decrease turnover, improve recruitment, and increase profitability through one concept: appreciation. In this episode, Paul and I talk about how to show the 5 love languages in the workplace, the benefits of appreciation at work, and the key difference between employee recognition and employee appreciation. We also discuss the most misunderstood love language in HR, workplace design for ADHD employees, the 4 misconceptions managers have about appreciation, and much more. All right, if you enjoy this episode, be sure to subscribe to Work for Humans wherever you listen to podcasts. Without further ado, my conversation with Paul White. Welcome, Paul White, to Work for Humans.
Thanks. I'm glad to be with you.
Glad to have you here today. So, I believe I'm probably the last person in the United States to have really heard about the love languages. And what you've done is you've applied love languages to work and spoken about that same thing in a lot of your writing and a lot of your work. Well, for other people, maybe I'm not the last person to have heard about it. And so can you just give a little background on that book and what that book brought to us?
Sure. So my colleague, Dr. Gary Chapman, wrote the 5 love languages. And actually, it's been out for 25 plus years. And it's a very unique book in the book industry in that it has sold more books every year than the prior year for 25 years. They're at 25 million plus. It's in 50, I know it's at least 50 languages. And so he's a marriage and family therapist. And the first part of his career, he just took notes in sessions of when people would share about feeling loved and what that looked like and when they didn't. And so then after about 10 years, actually, he went back and sort of went through his notes and found these themes. And so he found that there are 5 ways that people both try to send messages of love, that they care for somebody, as well as receive them. And those 5 languages are words of affirmation, quality time, acts of service, tangible gifts, and physical touch. And not necessarily sexual touch, but just physical touch. And basically, the premise that he found was that lots of times we get frustrated in relationships because we're trying to communicate that we love another person, but that is not their love language, the way that they feel loved. And so it's important to learn about each other's love languages and try to send messages in the way that is important to the recipient.
How did you decide to apply the same approach to work?
Well, earlier in my career, I grew up in the context of a family-owned business. And earlier in my career, I was consulting with family-owned businesses and wealthy families that had maybe sold their business and dealing with business succession and wealth transfer. And I was in North Carolina dealing with a father and son in this case. And the father was the CEO. And I was talking about the succession plan and how it's going. He says, "It's good. My son's stepping up. I think it's going to work." I walk across the hall and ask the son the same question. He says, "This is a disaster. It's never going to work. I can't ever please my dad." So then at that time, my wife and I were reading the 5 love languages, probably for the second or third time, because sort of a slow learner in applying those things. And so I thought, I wonder if this could apply in work-based relationships. So I pursued Dr. Chapman, and after a year, finally got through to him and pitched the idea. And for a variety of reasons, he agreed to work with me on, and we've done that here for the last 10 or 12 years.
And in my research on asking people what they want from work, I've started to realize that and partially through the podcast and talking to different people with different perspectives, is that sometimes work acts like a product that just gives you something utilitarian. And sometimes it acts like a service, and sometimes it acts like a relationship. And I think it's incredibly appropriate and incredibly right to start asking this question. And one of the people I interviewed, Fred Reichheld, spoke about love inside the organization and spoke about how the business should love customers and customers should feel loyalty and leadership should feel love toward the workforce. And so it was very interesting to talk to him about this sort of emotional layer. Do people in the practice of psychology who are practicing therapists, do they end up on a routine basis acting as a therapist, like a marriage counselor between the workplace and employees? I'm wondering how many people are going into therapy because of work.
Well, a lot go in because of the stress of work
Yeah.
and problematic relationships at work, as well as, I would say, fewer about the sense of purpose. Although, I mean, I'm a psychologist by training, and part of my career was around sort of career direction and assessment. And so there's that. But clearly, work creates a lot of stress in people's lives that they wind up, whether they start or about work, it's part of the issue that they're addressing in therapy.
And to what extent is appreciation at work something that comes from a person? And to what extent is it something that comes from the company as an organization?
This is my belief. Okay. So you or others may not agree, but I believe appreciation is person to person. And that while organizations can sort of send a message and communicate, it's really people within an organization. And so, in fact, we talk a lot about appreciation focusing on the person, whereas employee recognition, which is somewhat similar concept, really focuses on performance. And we believe that people have value beyond their performance in what they do, and that there are times when we value and appreciate somebody, but it's coming from me as a person rather than the organization. You can try the organizational thing, but I don't think it works real well. It sort of falls short typically. So that's my perspective and our perspective, that it really is between people. In some ways, that ties into some specifics, like, at Christmas time or the holidays, companies will send gifts to customers or vendors or whatever. And I really believe there's some pretty good research to show that's largely a waste of money from organization to organization. If you want to impact your relationship, it should be from you to the person with whom you relate at that organization, and either send a message or a gift or whatever. So again, it's between people, not companies.
If I'm a CEO and I'm thinking about appreciation in my organization, why should I care about whether or not it's being effective inside my organization?
Yeah, that's one of the sort of top 4 misconceptions that we address with leaders, is that they think the goal of appreciation is about to make people feel happy and good. And that's fine if that happens. I mean, obviously, we don't want that not to happen. But from an organizational point of view and leadership point of view, clear research, in fact, in our book, the 5 languages of appreciation in the workplace, we've got over 50 research citations showing the benefits, in essence, the ROI of appreciation to employers and companies. In fact, I was just with another researcher yesterday that they've just produced research that directly shows the impact of the level or amount of appreciation that an employee receives is really directly related to their retention, how long they stay at the company. So we know that when people feel valued and appreciated at work, that they're more likely to stay, staff turnover decreases. It's easier to recruit people because you're recruiting them to a warm, hopefully healthy workplace. We've got research that shows that it actually increases productivity, increases profitability, largely because staff turnover is the number one non-productive cost to a company. And if you can reduce that, it helps significantly. But also managers enjoy their work more and stay. Research shows there's less on-the-job accidents. So there's lots of good reasons. And it's, in fact, with the SEC is now starting to require publicly traded companies to demonstrate their plan for dealing with human capital because companies that have a plan and implement treating their employees well outperform profitability those that don't. And so that's an important factor for investors to consider.
I'm going to have to track down the person at the SEC who's doing that and have them on the show because that's a really interesting tidbit of information. I want to go through each of the 5, and then we'll branch out from there. And so the 5 are words of affirmation, quality time, acts of service, tangible gifts, and physical touch. And what I'd like to do, I'm going to be asking these questions as a designer, which is I'm a designer as a manager, I'm a designer as a professional who's thinking about how to design work and a work experience that's better. And so let's start with words of affirmation, which is what's a classic example of that in the workplace?
Yeah, so it's pretty straightforward. It's words that are affirming, that we're affirming the value of the other person, whether it's what they do or who they are. And we teach a model of how to give an effective compliment. It's 3 parts. It includes their name. People like to hear their name, that you know it. If you're writing it, you better spell it correctly. And secondly, be specific about what you value. And then third, why it's important, either to you, the organization, or customer. So it could be, Jana, thanks for getting your reports done in and on time to me. That helps me compile my report and turn around to my supervisor on time without stressing me out. So name, example, specifics, and then why it's important.
I just did that. I'm so proud of myself.
Good for you.
It's a situation where people had proactively on my team gone in and included some documents. And I just said, thank you for doing that. Because I was working on the weekend. I didn't want to reach out to them in the weekend and bother them for something. And it was already there. And so right in the moment, I just said, thank you. This is great that we're so on top of this. And it was that way I get to get my stuff done.
Let me just mention that for some people that are quite introverted or shy, that feels pretty intimidating. And that's where giving a written feedback, whether that's through a text or an email or whatever, is easier for introverts because you're in control of the conversation, right? And you don't have to think on your feet or worry about, your anxiety with the social interaction.
I've seen words of affirmation go wrong. And where I've seen them go wrong sometimes is I've just asked you to do something impossible and it just ruined your life for 2 months. And I'm going to say thank you. And then I'm going to do that again. And I'm going to say thank you. That was really important. But at some point, it starts to sound a little bit hollow because thanks may not, in other words, thanks. But if you do it again, thanks is not quite enough.
Yeah. Let me interject. So there's 5 languages. We have over 350,000 people who've taken our online assessment worldwide. It's in 7 languages. And we have a pretty good database, for us at least, of what people prefer. And less than half of employees choose words as the main way that they want to be shown appreciation. So if you only use words, either personally or as an organization, you're starting out by missing half of your workforce of how they really want to be shown appreciation. And so you're right. And there's some people are just like, words are okay. Some people, they grew up where words are cheap. Don't tell me you care, show me. It's a negative. And so we want to communicate it in the way that's meaningful to the recipient.
And even if we do that, is not necessarily the only thing. Let's talk about quality time. How does that show up?
Yeah, quality time's an interesting one that we've learned over time that there really is sort of a generational and age preference difference. For those of us that are older, including myself, in the old days, it was time with your manager or supervisor that made you feel valued, that you got time with them either to share some things or learn some things. For younger employees, that's less true. They're far more focused on their peer and collegial relationships. And so I often tell older managers, just because one of your team members has quality time as their primary language of appreciation doesn't mean they want time with you. You may be great, you may be wonderful, but they want to go hang out with their friends over lunch or after work. And that's about 26% of the workforce. So about 1 out of every 4. And if it is individual time, it is about focused attention, that they want to know that you're there with them. So still working on your computer, looking at your cell phone, if you're at a restaurant watching the TV over their shoulder, that doesn't cut it for them. So it's for individual time, it's focused attention. Otherwise, it's just being together and being included, doing things together with your colleagues.
And the word quality, does it mean the same thing for everybody? Or is there some texture there?
Yeah, there's some texture in it. And in fact, in our inventory, quality time was actually the language that we went from just identifying people's languages to the specific actions. Because I've had plenty of people say, I don't want time with my manager. They're pretty intense and I'm sort of shy, but I like to hang out with my friends. So we allowed people to choose the actions, but also from whom they want that, because they may want to get together and watch sports over the weekend, but they're not going to invite their supervisor. So context clearly is part of it.
I've noticed, for instance, that quality time for me is having a serious discussion about work and being heard and being listened to. Like a manager or anybody in the organization who comes to me and really listens to advice, that's quality time.
Yeah. Interestingly, for some people, and we have this item on our action list. One is to go to lunch and talk about work. The next one is go to lunch and not talk about work.
And not talk about work, right?
That it's quality time to talk about life rather than just work.
Right. And that makes sense to me too. Absolutely. How about acts of service?
Acts of service is an interesting one. A lot of people sort of jump to the conclusion that, I got to rescue somebody that's not producing well. That's really not it. It's really a specific act that you can do that helps make their day or week go better. I had one CEO tell me, his language was get her done. Don't tell him thanks. Don't, give him stuff. Just know he want to know you're on the team and help get things done. And it can be the easiest context to think about is when you're working on a time limited project and you're pushing hard and cranking to try to get it done. What's something somebody can do to help that? And that could be maybe sort of shield you from incoming phone calls or people stopping by and interrupting you or, answering emails. It could be that you delegate part of it to them, that they work on a piece, or it can be clerical kinds of things, whether it's printing or whatever. And it's just a sense of you're helping me by doing something. And a key part of that is you need to ask first and you need to identify what they feel like would be helpful rather than you looking at the situation and sort of either taking it over or trying to do something that they really don't want you to do.
I had a manager who would make bologna sandwiches. This is my first manager out of college. I was working as a criminal defense investigator, and I worked for this kind of genius PI. And he would make bologna sandwiches every day and chicken soup. You know what? I loved that. And I still look back on that, and we would argue about politics or whatever, philosophy or whatever. It was a quality time, but that bologna sandwich was a part of it. It was an act of service, and it made me feel part of a family. My team went on to then we just had a couple people get this very high-level certification, and the other manager and I baked a cake, and it said the name of their certification on it in candles, and we gave it to them. It was really nice.
Yeah.
I think there's so many millions of opportunities in a week to just do a little bit of that act of service.
Yeah, and that's what we found is that it doesn't take much to have significant impact. It's really getting the action right that's meaningful for that person. And it can have an example of an accounting person that was behind and needed to get back to some of the clients. And a friend saw that she was just sort of frantic and said, hey, can I help you out? And in our culture, usually the first answer is no, I'm good. And so you have to push through that a little bit. She said, well, if you wouldn't mind, if you could call these clients, let them know I haven't forgot about, help me get my life and mind sort of organized here. And so she did. It took 15 minutes over a lunch hour, did it. And the next week, the gal came back and shared. And she wasn't especially emotionally demonstrative typically, but she started to tear up and say, it's just nice to know that somebody noticed, offered, and did a little something. And it took 15 minutes. It made a big difference in their relationship as well.
How about tangible gifts?
Tangible gifts is one that in your context, I think is the most misunderstood in sort of the HR rewards recognition world. That whole world developed several decades ago out of behavioral sciences, finding that if we, identify some goals, define them, monitor them, and reward them, people tend to do them more frequently, which is good. And we want that to happen. But partly, as I said earlier, that it's appreciation isn't just about performance. There are times in our lives or even stages in our career where we're not the best at what we're doing. I mean, I had twins when I was a child protective services caseworker. And man, I rolled out of bed just 15 minutes before getting to work because it was sleep deprivation. I was not the best team member, but I didn't need some goal, or I just needed support, right? So anyway, a lot of times leaders think, well, it's rewards. And a lot of companies actually we show are spending and really wasting millions of dollars on reward kinds of things that don't get the result they want. Tangible gifts in our model are small things that show that you're getting to know the other person and what they like. So it could be bringing in their favorite cup of coffee, could be sending them a gift card to their favorite coffee shop or snack shop that's close by if they're working from home. Could be, sending them a subscription to a magazine that's related to their hobby, or a little something, maybe even something online about their favorite sports team. And you found this sort of cool article about maybe one of their favorite players. It's person to person, that they're starting to coach soccer for one of their kids. And so you find them a resource that helps for that. It's not about you do this, you get that. That's reward and recognition. That's fine. But we find that rewards on recognition programs tend to hit the top 10 or 15% of the team and the same team members. So you have a big middle group, 50, 60%, that are good people, show up, they're doing their job, but they just don't hear anything. And other research shows that, and in fact, one just came out by MIT that shows that a lack of appreciation is 4 times a greater predictor of somebody leaving than their level of compensation or whether they're going to get a raise. And so you have these people that are at risk for leaving, and that's where appreciation really makes a difference, that you're getting to know them as a person rather than just treating them as a work unit.
Do you happen to recall the title of that article from MIT?
No, but I can get it to you. It came out in January. And it's cited a fair amount, and it's part of it is around toxic culture is a better predictor, and that's 10 times more better predictor than compensation for people for leaving work.
Are you familiar with, I believe it was Aristotle, who had the concept of friends of gold, friends of silver, friends of bronze. And the difference is a friend of bronze was somebody really transactional, which is, I'm going to give you something if you give me something. But a friend of gold was, I want good for you for your own sake. It strikes me that those two examples that you gave kind of fall onto that scale, which is performance, pay for performance is, you give me this, I'll give you this. It's a contract, it's a deal, it's not appreciation. Do you find in general that pay for performance is an error?
Well, it depends how it's set up, partly, and whether you actually implement it. It can be a good thing. I mean, if a reward recognition program is designed well and implemented consistently, 2 key terms, then it can produce positive results. By itself, however, there are holes there that leave gaps about people's emotional and relational lives where I think appreciation with recognition for performance. And in fact, we have a number of companies that use them together, and it works well.
In companies, are there any engines of anti-appreciation? The reason I'm asking that is I can think of one right away, which is that the whole performance management piece is, we're going to say to 15% of people, we really appreciate you. And we're going to say to this enormous middle group, no, we don't appreciate you that much. That's the way it comes across, right?
Yep.
And I may have just worked so hard over the last quarter, and my response is, I don't appreciate you as much as some other people. Are there other engines like that in companies that you see that are machines of anti-appreciation?
I don't know that I can cite specific ones, but I can tell you sort of the general approach to work, that work is producing things or providing services that you get paid for. And that's what work is. But it forgets that the human element, that we are people, we have lives. I think that this is one of the positive elements that came out of the COVID pandemic, is that we realized how work and life are integrated, that bad things in life affect work and vice versa. And when you leave out the human element and just view it as a resource to use and use up and then throw away, bad things happen. I mean, there are very successful companies that are toxic for a while, but they don't last real long because when an employee isn't treated well, lots of times it spills over into their customer service and interactions or with suppliers. And so over time, it's sort of like in the late 1800s. I mean, the railroad barons and whomever. I mean, you can look at lots of examples of just using people as a natural resource rather than seeing them as human and having lives.
Let's talk about the trickiest one of all in a workplace environment, which is physical touch.
Oh, yeah. So, we wondered and asked friends and leaders, should we include this or not? Because it's part of the five love languages. And people would say, I don't know, it makes me sort of nervous, but I see it. And we chose to include it and continue for two reasons. One, Dr. Chapman had studied anthropology and had a firm conviction that we did not want to create a touchless society, even in the workplace. That physical touch in appropriate relationships and situations can be deeply meaningful, especially in medical care, long-term care, all that kind of stuff. Secondly, it happens. And so let's talk about it. And it's largely spontaneous celebration. It's a high five when you finish a project. It's a fist bump when you solve a problem, maybe a congratulatory handshake when you make a sale or whatever. Now, it differs culturally and regionally. Our both Latin friends and Southern Europeans are more physical in their sort of way of relating and not touching at all when they greet or see. It feels very cold to them. And then you have Northern Europeans and some of our Asian friends that there's clear boundaries about that. And you don't touch except for maybe a handshake, but even regionally. I mean, so I'm from the Midwest. I lived in Atlanta for a while, which is sort of pseudo South. And down there, they give side hugs. They see you give you a side hug. In New York, in New Jersey, they just sort of nod across the room and say, hey, and that's it. So, and there's some troubles. There's been troubles with some banks that have been acquired by New York firms that were based in Charlotte that, they didn't know how to greet each other. But it's there. It's less than 1% of the population. So it doesn't happen a lot, but it makes a difference. And it's helpful to be aware of it.
It seems to me that it might extend to other kinds of physical affection like eye contact or smile, or body language doesn't have to be body touch.
Right. And in fact, that's sort of where we go. And there's some decent research on this around sort of, for us, the equivalent of physical touch virtually. And it is a smile, eye contact, a warm greeting. And there's some new neuroscience stuff that, and I'll just throw this out there, even though I think a lot of your audience is in the tech virtual world, that there is a difference neurologically of our interaction when we're in the same room with somebody versus face to face, even if we have eye contact, all that. And I argue and will continue that virtual teams need to meet together in person at least occasionally to build healthy relationships.
I agree. And in particular, at least once. So I've worked on virtual teams where we were all misunderstanding each other until we got together once. And all of a sudden, by seeing the whole person, you could tell when they were being sarcastic, and you got a sense for it. There's a whole bunch of information that comes across through physical, whole body visual understanding of somebody's aspect. So yeah, I really agree with that. And I found that even once will make a difference for the rest of the time that you work together.
I agree.
So you've done a lot. You've collected a lot of data. And there's a way in which I'm hesitant to ask this question because I don't really believe in aggregate data when it comes to relationships between people.
Okay, that's fair.
Right? But what I mean is I'm going to ask questions because I really want to know the answer, but I also know that it may not be useful to know this answer, which is, have you seen any, when you cut the data different ways, do you see any patterns? Do you see patterns by country? Do you see patterns by age? You've mentioned age. Do you see patterns by gender? Anything else?
Yeah, and I agree with you. I mean, to know sort of general patterns for groups of people can be helpful in giving you tendencies and trends, but individuals within any group can differ. So it's all about, and really our emphasis is you need to find out what's impactful to the person with whom you're related and vice versa. But trends globally, and it's amazing how stable it's been over 10 years. Words of affirmation, 46% of the workforce. Quality time, 26%. Acts of service, 22%. Tangible gifts, 6 to 7%. Physical touch, 1%. So just culturally, there's a difference. Now, we're collecting data around international settings and so forth, but one of the ones that we had enough data to really look at was in Singapore. Acts of service is the highest language for them because it was a way to help them improve their career, essentially. I mean, that you were helping them perform because it's such a competitive, high density population area. It's very competitive. To get ahead at work is very difficult. So an act of service really meant a lot more than words. And then we looked at remote versus on-site employees and are there differences? And yeah, there are. It's interesting. The general pattern of words, time, acts of service, gifts pretty much stays the same, but time comes up closer. It's about 35 and 36% between time and words, which makes sense. If somebody's working alone, connecting with somebody and getting some individual time with somebody else is more desired. But what's interesting about that, and we did research during the pandemic of how people were stressed and what helped them. It's one of the key parts we found, two parts. One is that it's not just for managers. And in fact, that's one of our key messages. This is not just for managers and supervisors to do. It works best when colleagues and peers show one another appreciation as well. But in remote settings, hearing and connecting with your peers and colleagues is critical versus just, your supervisor's supposed to, right? They got to touch base and whatever. But secondly, that it's about personal things, about what's going on in your life, not just about work tasks. What'd you do this weekend? Did you see the games, this weekend? How are your kids doing? So we talk about, it needs to be personal and among peers. And you have to be proactive with remote workers because you don't have those chance sightings in the elevator or in the break room or whatever. And so if you don't proactively seek them out. So that was a trend. Age-wise, like I said, the patterns pretty much stay the same, but time is creeping up there, especially time with peers rather than supervisors. One interesting one to me was that gifts, what do we do when somebody retires or they've been there 25 years or whatever? We give them something, right? But for older employees, gifts drops down to 2%. People want that. It's like, don't give me stuff. Frick. What they want to hear is they want to hear how they themselves have impacted others. And so it really falls into words for them. Those are the main ones that come to mind.
I worked on a study once. I led an experienced design team at a former company. And the question that we asked people was, how do you want to be celebrated at your anniversaries, at your work anniversaries? We found enormous diversity. And we weren't trying for, it's qualitative research. So we weren't trying to get a statistical assessment of how many different people. What we were trying to get a sense of is what's the range of desires, in terms of what people wanted. Some people really didn't want the attention. They didn't want to be celebrated. They just wanted to be quiet in the back room. Just leave me alone. I'm an introvert. Let's not have a celebration. Some people wanted to be celebrated. And then you ask them, who do you want to be celebrated by? And they'd say, by my best friend at work. I want them to set it up. Or I want my manager to set it up. They actually cared who set up their celebration. Some people said, yes, I would like a gift. In Asia, we found, and again, this is not statistical at all. It's just that happened to be where we found it, is people liked the idea of a lottery ticket, something that had an element of chance and an element of luck.
Nice.
And so what that led to was the idea that we can't design one program for this. If we're going to design something, it needs to take into account what people care about in terms of this particular celebration, which was a little hard, except it started off by asking them.
Yeah. And that reminds me of a couple of things. One is when I speak or do training, every time I ask, how many of you really don't want to be recognized or shown appreciation in front of a large group? It varies, but it's on average about 40% of employees do not. Administrative assistants are higher, about 60%. Librarians are 90%. High-performing salespeople are like, where's the TV and cameras? Bring it on. I mean, and often they're the people that are designing these big group things. Secondly, about gifts, the most commonly given gift is food, which speaks to your example. I mean, your example about, baking a cake and making a little thing on the top of it. I mean, you were combining a bunch of things, act of service by baking it and so forth, but gift cards are more and more used. And we did some research and found that there's two groups. Some groups like generic gift cards that they can use for whatever. And other people want specific gift cards so they can't use it for whatever, so that they have to use it at the bookstore or wherever. It's interesting. Yeah. And I would say it's about, I mean, this is my sort of mantra, but appreciation is about person to person relationship. And so the organization, the way they can support it is provide the resources for a manager, supervisor to research and implement an appropriate gift, but not give everybody logo wear.
Yeah. One of the things about that cake that was so interesting was that the most valued part of that appreciation was the raspberry compote. Why? Because we cooked it from scratch. And that was the act of service, was taking the time to reduce the raspberry. It's very funny.
Yeah.
And is there a benefit to the appreciator?
Well, yes, I would say both directly and indirectly. Directly, I mean, if we sort of include appreciation within the larger pot of gratitude, there's a lot of research that shows physiological and emotional benefit to people who are thankful and have gratitude towards others or things, that their mental health and physical health are better. So that's sort of direct. Indirectly, we know that when team members feel valued, tardiness goes down, absenteeism goes down, following through on policies and procedures increases, customer service ratings go up, there's less conflict among colleagues. And so for a supervisor or manager, they now have more time to do the work that they're supposed to do rather than manage the crap that comes from people not feeling valued. Managers enjoy their work more when they help their team members feel valued.
Yeah, and that there's sort of the tangible benefits, those more indirect but more tangible benefits of expressing appreciation. I struggle with something here, and it's something that came up with Fred Reichheld too, who talks about loving your customer, is that my initial trigger for deciding to do good things for a customer may be that I want to win more business. As soon as I've made that decision, I think I should forget about the tangible benefits. As soon as I've made that decision, I think I should forget, because you don't want somebody, if you're a customer going into a store, you don't want somebody to do something nice for you at the same time looking at your wallet. You want them to actually show appreciation to you for you. And so there's this kind of necessary forgetting about the utilitarian nature of appreciation.
Yeah, I agree. At some point, you do it because it's the right thing to do. It's a good thing to treat people well. So what if you make more sales or whatever? I mean, if you treat people crummy, that's not a great way to live your life. And I agree with you. I mean, I have the tension of, our society is so research oriented. It's like, geez, do I have to research all this stuff to prove it to you? It's just like, just treat people well. Come on, And so, yeah, there's that tension. And clearly, in fact, I mean, one of our emphases is authentic appreciation, that we clearly delineate that if you don't appreciate, if you don't value somebody, you should not go through the motions. You shouldn't try to fake it, because it will undermine trust in a lot of different levels and really mess things up. And so we have you figure out why you don't. Sometimes you just don't understand the person. You come from different backgrounds, different personality styles. And what I found there for a while early on, I was like, well, just sort of appreciate people, but you can't gut it out. If it's not there, it's not there. But the answer, I believe, is to get to know the person better. As a result, there's some touchstones that happen that you find out, you both moved around, all you military brats, or you both played sports in high school or whatever, or you follow a certain team. And there's some touchstones that you can connect with people, or you find out a lot of people have had really tough lives or are in a tough situation. And when you find out about that, there's more compassion and empathy than if you just think, they should be able to pull it off and get it done.
Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, you've worked a lot with people who are diagnosed with ADHD.
Correct.
This is off topic of your book, although it may be related, which is, are there any particular workplace design opportunities for those with ADHD, of which I am one?
I believe so. I'm not a workplace designer in the sense that I don't bring that framework, but I can tell you some practical things that can make it easier. And I'm ADHD myself and have been, and one of my parts of my practice for 30 years is to evaluate individuals for both ADHD and dyslexia and different kind of stuff. One of the things is, well, it's just like anything, understanding the person is helpful. I think for people that aren't ADHD or not that familiar, there's a problem with diagnostic labels. And the problem is this. On the one hand, they're helpful because they communicate some information quickly. If I know somebody's been appropriately diagnosed with ADHD, I know they got problems with attention, concentration, focus, and distractibility. Just boom. That's the heart of it. But the problem is within that group, there's all different kinds of variations and individual differences that not every category fits it. So if you hear ADHD, you think, oh, they're hyperactive or fidgety or, sort of a brainless, disorganized kind of person. Maybe, maybe not. Sometimes there are inferences made because of labels that aren't true. But I would say that a key thing for understanding ADHD people is inconsistency is just like sort of hallmark on our foreheads. That there are some days we got it and we're firing on all pistons and just watch out. And then it could be later that day or the next day, we forgot what we were talking about or whatever. And it has to do with the neurology of remembering and pulling up information and all that. And also impulse control. I mean, that's a key, not for everybody, but for certain types of ADHD, that people that are impulsive, they tend to say and do things on impulse rather than thinking it through. So you got to sort of ignore the first thing out of their mouth and wait till they stop and think about it a little more. But a real critical design point is ADHD people tend to be cued visually. So if I need to remember to take something to work tomorrow, either I'm going to put it in the car ahead of time and on the seat next to me, not in the back seat, because if I don't see it in the back seat, I may forget it, or I put it on the island on the way out to the door. If I have to go to the dining room to pick it up, 50-50 chance at best that I'm going to remember. So visual cues are important. That's why in technology it can be really hard for ADHD people to have, they're always pinged on their phone or instant messages across the screen, that is just not helpful for them to stay focused on a task. And so understanding that visual cueing, it's sort of like what we see is what we're focused on now, and everything else is in the background if it's there at all.
Yeah, it's interesting. As somebody with ADD, on average, I'm amazing. But there's a lot of variation in how amazing I am. I'll be the first to tell you I'm amazing on average. But as a result of that, it occurs to me that one thing that I would like as a language of appreciation is forgiveness. It's probably not something that pops very often in that, which is that just the other day, I was so focused on something, I worked through an important meeting. I was so focused in the moment. And I just was like, well, I try to forgive myself on that, and I hope I get some forgiveness.
Yeah, and I think that's a part of ADHD that's confusing to people. That some in the old days when it was just called ADD by itself, that's a confusing part in itself. ADHD doesn't necessarily mean they're hyperactive. There's now one global term and there's different subtypes, one of which doesn't have hyperactivity. But in the old days when it was ADD, sometimes we refer to it as attention discontrol disorder, meaning that sometimes you get really hyper-focused on something and you can't get off of it. Or for ADD kids, if they're watching a show and you're trying to give them instructions, that changing focus or transitions are really hard. So that's confusing. Well, how can you have an attention deficit and you get hyper-focused? Well, it's because you're focused on this one thing and you haven't focused as much as you should on other things as well.
That's really interesting. William James, I've mentioned this in another show too, said that consciousness is an attention allocating device. And so you can sort of understand that device might be tuned differently for different people. How they allocate attention might be tuned differently. And I can't remember what is the name of that sort of hyper attention state. It's like,
well, some people just call it hyper-focused.
Hyper-focused, yeah. And super handy, but not in every situation.
Right.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, I think that part we were saying about how understand the utilitarian aspects of appreciation, but then forget that and just do the right thing. What's most important to me about the 5 different languages is recognizing that my language might not be your language.
Absolutely. For me, as a psychologist, and I've worked with kids and adolescents and families over the years, our culture, a strong weakness of our culture is teaching perspective taking ability. That is being able to see a situation from another person's point of view. And this is sort of a core lesson that we have to teach some people that not everybody feels appreciated the same way you do. And it's really helpful to have some group discussions about this, in fact, we take people through an activity, identify your primary language, one action that's important to you within that language, and then tell why that's important. Because we found lots of people may have the same language, may or may not share the same action, but the why, the reason. And it can be from a childhood experience, it could be from a previous work experience, it could be some other value. And being able to understand, it helps us when we're dealing with a person that has a language appreciation that's really our least. In fact, we identify people's least valued language because it's your blind spot. It's the one you don't think about, but you have team members that are going to have that, and you've got to sort of get that on your radar.
Yeah, I can totally see that. So here are my closing questions, which I ask everybody, which is, what job do you hire your job to do for you?
Well, at a basic level, I hire it to provide for me and my family physical things that we need, want, and desire. I get to go fishing occasionally on a nice trip because I earn enough money that we have some left over for that. So, and, provide for my wife and get gifts for my grandkids and all that. So there's that. And then the intellectual stimulation that it brings of interacting like this or attending, a situation, even the process of providing services. When I do a training with a team, I love it because I'm interacting and finding out how they're thinking about it and how does this apply to a construction company versus nurses in a hospital versus a virtual tech team. And so there's an intellectual stimulation that comes about it and learning, as well as a sense of worth of being able to provide resources and services that help, at least been told to, and seems to, make people's daily lives better. And so have a sense of value from that.
What does it cost you?
It costs time and energy and commitment. One of the things so I've had the privilege of working with Dr. Chapman, who has this huge brand. And I've often said that if I wrote the same book and sold it on my own, I would have sold 5,000 copies. I mean, we sold 550,000. So when I worked with a marketing person early on, they wanted to get the New York Times bestseller list and all that. Didn't happen. Didn't bother me. I didn't expect it. I mean, it's life and work takes persistence and perseverance over time. It doesn't come easy. And that's costly. I mean, it takes some discipline and you have to say no to certain things that you might want to do otherwise. But for me, and I turned 65 not too many months ago, and I'm just sensing the amount of energy, emotional and mental energy it takes for me to produce, to create. It drains me. And so, that's a cost for sure.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, a part of it you mentioned is the opportunity cost of it's taking time away from other things. Yeah, time and energy. Well, thank you very, very much. I've learned everything that I was looking for. Is there something I missed in this conversation? Like, is there some area like you think people misunderstand about this that I should include?
I don't think that you missed it. We do talk about sort of 4 major misconceptions that leaders have. One, that employee recognition is the same thing as appreciation, which I believe is not. Secondly, that most people, when they hear appreciation, they think that it's words, and that appreciation really, as we've demonstrated, is more than words. Third, that the goal is just to make people feel good. And from a business point of view, there are a lot of practical benefits. And we talk about it when a team feels appreciated, they become a functional, healthy, effective working group. And that's what people want, right? At work that we put in, yeah, you got to work, but good things happen as a result. And then lastly, that a lot of people think that appreciation is the sole or primary responsibility of the supervisor or leader. And clearly, there are a lot of teams that the leader's not that interested in, but the team is and carries it off. It works best when the leader's involved, but it's too much responsibility for a leader to do on their own. And you've got to, that's why we train team members how to communicate appreciation and identify the languages of one another rather than just for the leader. And you can have the concepts, but I always say, start somewhere with somebody. You can think about it and know, but if you don't say something or do something for somebody, it doesn't work.
Great. Where can people learn more?
So our sort of mothership website is appreciationatwork.com. And it's the word at, not the at sign, but appreciationatwork.com. And it's there, our book, our assessments, training materials, all that kind of stuff. Free videos, all that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
You bet. My pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.